Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed a brief break. Our next constellation of stars on a panel have come to a discussion about what's been happening in London, what's going to happen in London, and what that's going to tell us about broader health economies. You will already know all of these people, but because a chair has to do this, it's my pleasure to introduce Sir Robert Naylor of UCLH, Dame Ruth Carnall, currently the Mayor's Advisor on Health, formerly the Chief Executive of NHS London, Nick Samuels, currently the Director of Communications for the Foundation Trust Network and previously Director of Communications for Imperial and a variety of other organisations in London, and Dr. Clare Gerada, former President of the Royal College of Chair of the Royal College of GPs, currently the Principal Lead for the Hurley Group of Practices, and also advising NHS England on primary care reform. So I've asked each of our speakers to just give you their thoughts about the changes that we've seen in the London health economy, shamelessly being London-centric here, as that's where we are, and the capital tends to inform politicians and their thoughts about health and health reform, perhaps to a significant degree, because it's on the Westminster doorstep. And also, I think, to add in some thoughts about how the health economies around a major conurbation are going to change over the next few years, with the impact of the reforms and the impact of financial stringency that we've been talking about, and particularly give us a few thoughts on actually what that's going to mean for you in the pharmaceutical and medtech industry. So, Claire, if I could ask you to go first.
Are you going to time?
I'm going to time. Rufus.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. So, London, an extraordinary place to be a GP. General practice is troubled at the moment, and I'm sure many of you pick that up on your travels, or if you read the Daily Mail, or worse still, the Evening Standard, you will also pick up how troubled we are. Nevertheless, we're on track to have probably one of the largest transformation of primary care that we've seen since 1948, and not a transformation that will disrupt the way we work in the sense of how the Health and Social Care Act did, but a transformation that will go with a direction of travel that makes sense and deliver care to patients that they want. So more accessible care, more care on the day, only one call, click or contact, better continuity of care, better use of e-health, and what we call more proactive care, so keeping people healthy for longer. NHS England London has just published a set of standards for pre-consultation, and those standards actually lay out what we think should be delivered by general practitioners and their practices. Now, we haven't dictated a model of care. We haven't said this is how you should work. But of course, if we're delivering a set of standards that include 24-hour access, not 24-hour, 7-day-a-week access to general practice and many others, it will force GPs to work differently. And where it may impact on you, I would say in the next 5 years, when we fast forward, that there won't be such a thing as a single practice entity. Practices will be working much more in networks, much more in federations, whatever you want to call them, but legal constructs where care is delivered across populations, with practices sharing resources, sharing staff, and actually starting to organise themselves around natural populations with community services embedded within there. There's a lot to unpick in that, a lot of ifs and buts, etc., etc. But it's already happening in London. It's already happening in North West London, South East London, outer South East London, in all sorts of areas, Tower Hamlets. And what you will find is, rather than having to knock on every single practice door or contact every single practitioner, you will have a much more formal structure, a much more organised structure, rather like if you went in to try and find somebody at UCLH, you would talk to Robert Naylor's office, etc., etc. You wouldn't knock on every single ward. So I'll leave it at that, because that's probably 3 minutes, but if you are engaged with general practitioners at the moment, if you've got any contact with GPs at the moment, be kind to them. They are in a desperate state at the moment. Be kind to them, love them, support them, tell them how hard they're working, and tell them what is fundamentally the truth, that is that GPs keep the NHS safe, value for money, and accessible. Thank you.
That's splendid. Thank you very much. 3 minutes almost. Absolutely. 3 minutes almost a second. Nick.
Yes, hot news, the Royal College of General Practitioners is renaming itself the Royal Society for the Protection of General Practitioners. London, as Clare said, is an extraordinary place, and one of the things I think you notice is the London you experience as a Londoner, its vibrancy, its diversity, the many opportunities, is slightly different to the London you experience as a patient. The choice, the pace, the opportunity just seems somewhat dulled, and the NHS seems to be somewhat behind where London is. And to a certain extent, we can look at the past with rose-tinted glasses. It has been ever thus. We always think it was better than it was. And the NHS has been slow to change, has always been slow to change, but does change. And it changes at different paces in the way that London does. If you look at certain boroughs, you'll see very little difference between them today as there were 30 years ago. And the same, to a certain degree, unfortunately, with certain parts of the NHS in London. If you look at other parts of London, this is a city that put the Olympics up in 4 years. It's the same city that's created academic health science centres in even less time in significant parts of it. It's a city that's building Crossrail in 5 years and has transformed certainly the acute sector estate in London in a similar time frame. So there are different paces going on, and I think the trick is to match the experience and expectations we have on the personal side as individual Londoners with how we see and use our health services, and to try to marry the two more closely.
Nick, thank you very much. Very much.
Hi, 3 minutes. I'm going to just, 3 major points really. What's the problem we're trying to solve? What are the barriers to solving it? And are there any sources of optimism around us that we could latch onto? So the first thing to say is London health services have been reviewed since 1892, and there's been 11 major reviews since then. Broadly, all of them have said the same. So what that says is we're not tackling the basic problems, yet we're having a lot of goes at it. It must be very difficult to do. Key issue across the whole of London is diversity. Fantastic in some aspects, it gives us this wonderful city, terrible in others. So the best sitting next to the worst. London is the childhood obesity capital of the world. Grotesque health inequalities across the city. Gross maldistribution of resources. The best, in some cases in the world, are sitting right next to the worst. Excessive reliance on hospitals because of inadequate investment and appropriate development of primary and community care. So I could go on with a long list, but essentially any indicator you want to look at in London, you can see the best and the worst. So that's the problem we've been trying and failing to tackle. The barriers to doing something about it. First of all, anything you do in London, massively high political profile. You end up on the front page of not just local newspapers, but national ones as well. You have number 10 interested rather than just your local MP. That makes everybody actually quite cautious about what they want to do. Fragmented leadership after the reforms. One statistic, there used to be 7 commissioning organisations in London, there's now 74. And it's meant to cost half as much. Fragmented leadership in provision as well. There's only one model in town, that's the Foundation Trust model. It's very rigid. Actually what we need to do is to develop some different sorts of provider models. You need clinical leaders to deliver change. For most of them, it's an absolutely brutal experience as doing so, being humiliated on public platforms routinely and not supported when they come to try and make decisions. And the process of consultation and engagement and trying to deliver any change is a complete nightmare of bureaucracy that's been built up over almost since 1892 actually, or so it seems when you're trying to plough your way through it. Sources of optimism. Fantastic local clinical leaders in every hospital in London, in every community, in GPs, in hospitals, everywhere. Fantastic clinical leadership, not just doctors, nurses and others as well. Increased emphasis on transparency, post-mid staff, horrible experience for all of us, but actually everybody now focused on putting information about quality firmly into the public domain. Wider recognition of the need for change, some of Bruce Keir's work, 7-day working, I think that will help. Some evidence of improvement, so things like stroke care in London, other changes as well, seeing that people can actually make change. The development of networks, and in particular, the Academic Health Sciences Centres in London and their ability to drive improvement as a result of their excellence out into communities and beyond. She would say this, wouldn't she? But the Mayor's role, I do think he can coordinate, I do think he can champion, I do think he can challenge. I think the profile of that role can be used to good effect. And last but not least, the fact that we haven't got any money is a good source of impetus really for change. You haven't got any money, you've got to do something different. We have to do something different about the way in which we use what's now £15 billion worth of resources in London. So some sources of optimism.
Thank you very much. Last but by no means least, Sir Robert.
Thanks, Andy. Like the others, London's a fantastic city. I get the privilege to travel pretty widely and explore healthcare systems elsewhere in the world. And I personally think that London stands up to anywhere in the world. And in some respects, which I might refer to in a moment, I think it's ahead of other major capitals. So what is happening in London? Well, not a lot on the surface, but when you scratch the surface, there's a huge amount going on underneath. Clare's already mentioned what's the revolution, perhaps, that's beginning to happen in primary care, and in my view has been needed for a long time, but also a revolution in hospital services is needed. Just to exemplify the difference between the importance of London, to build on what Ruth just said, when I decided to come, this is my 30th year as Chief Exec, so I did 15 years in Birmingham, and I'm nearly 15 years in London, in 2 big teaching hospitals. I went to see my friend Simon Stevens, who was Tony Blair's advisor at the time, to ask his advice about whether I should go to UCLH, and he pondered for a moment. He looked at me and said, "You know, Robert, if you screw up in Birmingham, you might get a phone call from number 10. But if you screw up at UCLH, we'll bloody well send the car around for you." And I'd only been there 6 months, trying to take over Great Ormond Street Hospital, that Ruth might remember, and the car dutifully came around for me, and I was told to just quiet it down. You've only been here 6 months. Well, 15 years later, I still haven't acquired Great Ormond Street Hospital. It'll come. It'll come. So much of London remains the same, has remained the same in principle. As it was in 1948. GPs, not all GPs, but many GPs, a very high proportion of single-handed or small practice GPs still act like independent contractors, and as Clare has already indicated, that has to change. Hospitals are moving towards foundation trust status, but only about half of the hospitals in London have actually achieved it yet. The last count, I counted up potentially 42 foundation trusts in London, and I said on a number of public platforms that in due course there's only space probably for about a dozen trusts. So that means a lot of rationalisation, because the smaller trusts, particularly those who haven't made foundation trust status for 10 years, how are they going to make it in the next 10 years with the economic situation as we see it? So there has to be some degree of rationalisation, and politicians are running away from that, have run away from that for a long time and continue to do so. But beneath the surface a lot has changed. Certainly there's been massive demographic changes in London, population ageing, care of the elderly, which used to block our hospitals with hundreds of elderly people with nowhere to go, and really no longer there just because they're old. The turnover of hospitals now is fierce, it's rapid, we no longer count length of stay in terms of days, we count it in terms of hours, and we want to know why patients haven't gone home at 10 o'clock in the morning because the next patient's waiting in the corridor to take the bed for their day surgery. So the pace of change in hospitals has changed dramatically. The number of patients coming to us, take my trust for example, we have a relatively new hospital at UCH. It was designed for 65,000 attendances in A&E per year. This year we're going to top 130,000. So there's been a massive increase in the number of patients coming in our direction. And the NHS to some extent is a victim of its own success because it is such a good system. And building on I think what Chris and Rob said earlier on, if you look at the comparisons across the world, the NHS in the UK is rated second only to Holland, and certainly well above most of the other European healthcare systems in terms of the overall parameters. We come top in some things like efficiency and effectiveness, we come low in terms of fragmentation, so patients find it really tough to find their way around, and that's why everyone's talking about integration. Clare's already referred to that, but there are many different definitions of what integration is. My own definition is the collaboration between primary, community, secondary and tertiary care in a sort of integrated, accountable care organisation. Again, that's referred to in the previous session. But who's going to lead these changes? I can't see GPs individually leading them. although there are some great leaders like Clare and others around London. I can't see the GPs themselves. I think if anyone's going to create accountable care organisations, it may well be the new CCGs. But I think hospitals are going to have play a major part in that, because we have the, if you like, the capacity and capability in terms of management expertise and resources, access to capital, to enable the changes that need to be made. Personally, I don't think at the moment that politicians have the stomach for the changes that are needed. We are heading for a cliff edge. Some will argue that we're already there. About a third of the hospitals in the NHS are currently in deficit. That will increase to about half of the hospitals by the end of this financial year. My money would be on the politicians having to put some more money into the health service, because the public will demand it. I suspect some more money will have to come in before the election, and then there's going to have to be a major rethink after that. So notwithstanding all these problems, particularly in London, the NHS remains hugely, hugely popular. Patient satisfaction. Most of your companies will give their right arm to have the satisfaction that we get from our customers. Staff satisfaction surveys are extraordinarily high. Morale and motivation of staff, I speak more about my own trust, we measure it in intense detail, is extremely high. My job is all about reputation and motivation. Just to finish with, the powerhouse behind many of the changes in the future, I think, will come from what was mentioned in the last session, the academic health science centres. I'm extremely proud to be a founding member and part of UCL Partners, which I think has been blazing the way in terms of developing the philosophy of improving the status of healthcare, creating networks between hospitals, centralising specialist services like pancreatic cancer surgery in one place rather than 10 places. We've recently agreed to effectively give away our beloved Heart Hospital, which is a wonderful, fantastic unit, in recompense for the centralisation of a large number of complex cancers from all the hospitals around a population of 6 million people in UCL Partners to be hubbed at UCLH. Now, I think that's an opportunity for you guys for the future, because we're now beginning to create hubs and nuclei, if you like, of healthcare systems. And those are the places that you really should be attracting your attention to. The UK has a fantastic record in biomedical research. The UK produces something like 15% of the world's leading biomedical research, from a population in the UK of 0.5% of the world's population. So we outstrip everywhere else in the world in research and development, and I think your industry needs to collaborate much more effectively with ours in promoting and building upon that fantastically sound base that we have for the future. So thank you very much.
Well, that's a set of stunningly succinct presentations from our panel, all of whom have to some extent, I think, hidden their lights under a bushel of modesty. And it occurs to me that it is actually worth just briefly talking about the individual achievements of each of our panels. Dr. Clare Gerada, the Hurley group of practices was really one of the innovators in terms of providing primary care, not just at local practice unit, but at genuine scale, and actually expanding into some of the most deprived communities in London. Some of you may have seen in the media that the Hurley group got a slight beating up from regulators, which I think is a reasonably widespread view that that was not an appropriate consideration of the socio-economic demographics that many of the practices serve.
It was the Evening Standard, not the regulator.
It was the Standard?
It was the Evening Standard. The regulator wasn't at all involved. It was the Evening Standard that decided to pull out a data that was a year old and publish it and say I was the worst GP in London. I promise you I'm not.
Remind us who the data was?
The data is standard data. It's NHS Choices data. It's the data that you click on to. It's the data where we sample, that patients are sampled, 50 patients out of 15,000. I think it's 100 patients out of 15,000 are sampled on a linear scale, asked how you rate access, how you rate services, etc. And for access, the particular practice was in the bottom quartile for one practice. And for some reason, this made page 20 of the Evening Standard, with a horrible photo, which was actually even worse than the photo.
So it's almost as if you'd taken some kind of public position on political things, which made people want to...
Nothing to do with
Nick Samuel's breadth of experiences in communications in organisations across London, more or less unrivalled, as is his network of contacts and knowledge of where bodies are interred. Dame Ruth Carnall oversaw the crucial centralisation of hyperacute stroke services across London, a massive battle which took several years and was perhaps not always given the level of political support it might have been, and has resulted in empirical, highly measurable improvements in the quality of care for the population of London. Sir Robert, obviously the Chief Executive of an incredibly high-profile trust, a PFI innovator beyond comparison, acquirer of the Heart Hospital. I could go on for a very long time, but this is a panel who are deeply knowledgeable in their subject. So we're delighted to take questions and comments from the floor. We've had a number sent to us by email, so again, thank you if you did that. I could ask my colleagues who have the roving microphones to make themselves ready, and if I can ask you to sort of wave your hands dramatically in the air. Just before we start that, I'd just like a quick thought from everybody about what, in practical terms, you expect is going to happen to the provider landscape, primary, secondary and tertiary care, and community and mental health, in the capital. What's going to happen over the next 12 to 18 months? Robert?
Well, I think it's virtually nothing over the next 12 months because we're in a pre-election period, but I think a lot depends upon how much additional money comes into the health service. So what's really not well known is that those who are foundation trusts are fairly autonomous organisations, and we have to balance our books, otherwise we get hauled over the coals by the regulator, and effectively we get our status taken away from us. Those that aren't foundation trusts, many of them are running deficits and they're being subsidised through all sorts of different sources. I've argued with both the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State, I'm seeing him again, I saw him last night, I'm seeing him again this week, arguing that they must stop subsidising what I call failing organisations. Now that's a pretty emotive term, but hospitals that have failed to become foundation trusts and are getting handouts are now beginning to calculate how much they can get away with. It's the story that we had 20 years ago. It was how much deficit can you get away with without getting into real trouble? So when that gets exposed, that's going to be really difficult for politicians to expose that. Then I think there are going to be lots of failing hospitals that need to think about their futures. And I said earlier on, of the potential 40-odd trusts that could be in London, I personally don't think there's room for much more than a dozen, but it might take 5 years to get there. So I think we will see amalgamations of hospitals, whether it's mergers, acquisitions, or collaborations, or whatever it is. But we can't sustain the current number of trusts that we have in London. And we also can't sustain the fragmentation of specialist services. There are huge variations in mortality rates. My trust's mortality rate is about 30% below the national average across the whole range of services we provide, which means there must be some trusts, statistically, that are about 30% above the national average. Now that's a disgrace. Disgrace in London, disgrace nationally. And I think what we need to do is to pair up those hospitals that have got a grip of things with those that haven't got a grip of things and transfer best practices from one to the other. I think this has to happen, but politically it's dynamite, because the first thing that happens is that the local people say, does this mean the closure of our maternity unit, our children's unit, our A&E department? And you get people marching up and down the high street threatening politicians, and politicians back off it. And that, I think, is the main reason why we haven't seen a rationalisation of services in London in the same way as we had in Birmingham. When I went there in 1985, I was there for 15 years. Birmingham had God knows how many hospitals, single specialty hospitals. When I left 15 years later, today there are really only 2 hospitals in Birmingham that run the city of Birmingham. That's happened in Birmingham because it's not London, it doesn't have the politics of London, it has to happen in London, but probably won't happen for some time to come.
So Robert, you once did an HSJ roundtable about just over a year ago, I think. We were on the subject of mergers and acquisitions, and you said there's no such thing as mergers, there are only acquisitions. Do you think simply the strong will acquire the weak?
Well, I've never come across a merger in the health service. They've been termed mergers because it's politically softer and it's easier for the trust of the hospital that's being acquired. But in reality, they're acquisitions. They're one organisation incorporating the other. So I think that's what's got to happen in the future. but it's really, really, really difficult. But the thing that's going to drive it is going to be the money. And I think that creates opportunities, it creates huge challenges. But if we don't go down that route, then I can't see how London's health services can survive financially for very much longer. I take the strategy at UCLH. We're in quite a relatively strong financial position. And my strategy essentially is to be last man standing, because if I am, then something will happen before they get to me. So it really is a challenging perspective, and I'm very interested in Ruth's comments because she was responsible for the whole of London for a number of years.
It's all my fault. That he isn't in charge of the whole thing. So I agree with a lot of what Robert says. Actually, I'd put a slightly different slant on it though. It is a fact. Many of the existing small hospitals in London will not make it as foundation trusts. And I wouldn't describe them necessarily as failures, although patently some of them are. In many cases, the reason why they are failing to deliver what's expected of them is because they are being asked to do things that they're not remotely equipped to do and never have been. So they're being asked to substitute for primary care in many cases. They're being asked to provide genuinely acute care when they haven't got the scale to do it. They're being asked to serve a population's needs when they haven't got the range or capability that they would need to do that, and nor do they have the authority to do it. So you put somebody in a position where they cannot do what's expected of them, then they will fail. The problem with terming them failures is that damns them as leaders and as managers and as clinicians and everything else. And actually, in some of those places, you'll find some of the best clinicians in their field and some of the best leaders, good people struggling with difficult problems, not people who are incompetent, and often they look the same. And if we term them the same, I don't think that's helpful. But to the extent that I agree with Robert that many of the existing trusts in London will not become foundation trusts, and therefore an alternative will have to be found. It won't be found in the next 12 to 18 months. Because, as Robert said, the lead up to the election, you try and change the colour of the paint on the front door of any of our well-loved hospitals and you'll be in trouble, especially in London. So I think we need new forms of provider networks probably. I think organisations like Robert's need to be incentivised to take over such places and provide services and a wider range of services in those locations. I think they need to be both incentivised to do it and also offered some protections against what otherwise would be a regulator coming down on him like a ton of bricks if he said he would tomorrow morning take over Queen's Hospital Romford, which I've always wanted him to do, and he's always been very reluctant to do it. And so that's resulted in me accusing him of polishing gold, which he's decided actually is a term, I think he's decided it's praise, but it isn't actually, because gold's already shiny, you just make it a bit shinier. We do need to think about how to support local services, and I can't see a way of doing that without more investment, at least in a transitional period. I can't see how we can deliver the change that's necessary without investment in primary care, and I can't see how it can be done without a different set of incentives around genuinely delivering integrated care. So saying to Robert, you are responsible for the health of this population, you manage it in this way, you take the risk on how many of these people need to come into hospital. And that can't be done without funding the transition. You have to carry on running what we've got at the same time as you're trying to create something new. And I don't see either, on the one hand, the brave decisions being made about this scale of change that's necessary. 10, 12 trusts in London, maybe. Nor do I see somebody providing that level of transitional funding to support change in London. Not right this minute, but eventually that's what's going to happen.
Nick, you've been associated with organisations going through merger or acquisition. You've been around communications of change for the capital for a decent period of time. What's going to happen and how is it going to be sold to politicians and the public?
I have been acquired, and it's an interesting experience. I think the next 12 months we've already had some very early warning signs of the local elections in London as to how it's going to play out. It's all political for the next 12 months, and it's not the politics of anything sensible, any high policy and high values. It's naked street fighting, it's trench warfare. It's a highly marginal city, London. It has the potential to decide who governs the country, given the number of seats which may change hands. And that means anything exciting happening in those marginal seats will be of national significance and will be taken out of all proportion. Secondly, anything not exciting happening in any of those seats will also be taken out of proportion. So politicians will have to find something exciting. And what politicians love to be able to say about the NHS is that they're saving it. However, to save it, you have to save it from something. And therefore, politicians will always say they're saving it from something that the others are doing. And we've had a perfect example in West London where Hammersmith and Fulham Council changed hands in the local elections. It's a council that's very dear to my heart, as I was Director of Communications for the hospitals at Imperial, and we did a lot of business with Hammersmith and Fulham Council, reasonably antagonistically. And what's interesting about the experience in Hammersmith and Fulham is that Hammersmith and Fulham Conservatives have complained viciously that Labour was scaremongering about the closure of Charing Cross Hospital, and that is what caused people to switch their allegiance. This is the same council, that got elected 10 years ago by claiming that Charing Cross Hospital was under threat and only the Conservatives could change it. So both sides will claim the same. If you're the governing party, you'll be blaming what happened 5-10 years previously. If you're the opposing party, you'll be blaming what's happened in the last 5 years. And it's not going to be about, as I said, high policy. It's going to be about claims that's privatisation or that's unsafe and we're saving you from the others. And it's difficult to tell where the spotlight will fall, but at some point spotlights will fall on a hapless trust, on a hapless management team, on a hapless doctor, and they will come to epitomise everything that's worst about the NHS, which the other side will then come in to say. And I think the other experience that certainly Ruth went through in the last election was that both Shadow and actual Secretary of State suddenly went around saving things for which there were long-standing plans. Long-standing plans for which a degree of consensus had been built up. But during an election period, consensus formed apart, as I said, it's trench warfare, and those plans were put back 3 years, 5 years. And I have another experience. I've worked for some of the best, which I don't want to categorise the alternative to that, but I've also worked for one at Chase Farm Hospital in North London. And very good people, very interesting institutions. I've been treated there, as have my family. Those were institutions which, as Ruth said, they're not bad in themselves, but systematically they were set up to fail. They were set up in a structure which just is unsurvivable. Interestingly, Barnet Hospital was built for no strategic purpose other than the fact that it served the constituency of Finchley and Golders Green. The proprietor at the time was one Margaret Hilda Thatcher. All the sense at the time said if you're going to rebuild hospitals in North London, you rebuild the two either side of it rather than the one in the middle. We rebuilt the one in the middle, and the health economy up there has been unsustainable ever since. And it's taken 20 years to move to a stage with lots of political interruptions whereby quietly that is being unpicked. And I think one of the things to draw attention to is that don't confuse trusts with hospitals necessarily. When we talk about 12 trusts in London, we're not talking about 12 hospitals, we're talking about 12 management teams, 12 groups of leaders, clinical, managerial, nursing, leading a whole plethora of healthcare services on the ground across many sites, across many disciplines. Trusts are the organisational arrangement, they're the holding company, they are the leadership, they are the controlling mind, but their tentacles will spread far. So if we look in West London, we'll see the number of trusts reduce significantly. I suspect that process is beginning. We did it at Imperial. We merged 3 hospitals, 2 trusts and 1 medical school. We still have 3 hospitals, but we only have 1 trust. And I guess the real trick over the next 12 to 18 months is not to look at what you can't do because of the politics, but what can you do in spite of the politics. And there's a huge amount of innovation, of excitement that can happen under the surface. There's a huge amount you can be getting on with, and don't just look to the end and think, oh no, there's a general election coming, we won't do anything just in case we risk walking the apple cart. Get on and identify what you can do, what people won't notice, which will make a fundamental difference, or at least prepare you for the free fall that is potentially going to happen afterwards.
Thank you. I worked in Chase Farm as well. It's a wonderful place. I'll try and answer the question, which is what do we think is going to be in the next 12 to 18 months. I hope, and sincerely hope, that my profession will still be able to provide 1.2 million consultations a day, 10,000 children seen per hour in London by London GPs. And I say that not to be alarmist, but I'm sure many of you know that we are finding it impossible to fill partnerships, salaried posts, impossible to fill training posts, and we have an attrition rate of about 25% going to New Zealand, Australia and South Africa. So I genuinely hope that we do something urgently, and I know Ruth and myself from a different spectrum are working on this as we speak. If we do survive the next 12 to 18 months, and I think the space to be is in general practice, primary care, I think we're going to see over the next 5 years a significant transformation in the way we work. I think we will see, and again I don't like talking models because I think it forces us down, but let's talk models. In order to deliver the standards, practices will have to work in populations, natural populations of say 50 to 100,000. But within that, as Robert's been saying, organisations that are maybe up to 1 million, where you start to deliver, as a provider organisation, services at scale to populations, but at smaller scale, depending on what the services are, so health visiting, end-of-life care, etc., etc. But I think we're going to start to see these sort of bodies, these sort of provider organisations develop from the ground up, and they are already being developed. There are slight complications that we're seeing already, which politicians love to meddle, and what they do is they create difficulties. So we're seeing the non-geographical, the ability for any of you now to register with any GP in the country is actually going to complicate matters, because how on earth do you provide care to a population if you don't know who your population are? And we're also seeing the formation of non-geographical federations, which actually, again, cause serious problems in that how can you start delivering services at scale across a population if your federation is spread across different populations. Now, you may want to ask me that about the Hurley Group, but we try and work with the federation that we're in within the local borough. I think going forward in 5 years' time, looking back, we'll find it extraordinary that we don't have district nurse or nursing teams with omnicompetent skill. So at the moment a patient might have 5 different nurses, and think how precious nurses are, going in to see them: the heart failure nurse, the district nurse, the practice nurse, the diabetes nurse, and then the generic nurse from the hospital just to check that they're sorting out. That is no longer going to be sustainable, and I think we're going to see far more integration. Is a funny word, there's actually 42 definitions, but far more shared working across the transitions from home to hospitals, across the transitions from hospital to home. Far more cross-working, far more hospital doctors moving out of the confines and working with us in general practice to deliver care, and equally us working in hospitals to deliver care. So I think we're going to go into a space in the next 5 years that actually makes sense for patients, certainly makes sense for GPs, and it certainly makes sense for the vast number of community staff that we have working on our behalf. So I'm actually very, very optimistic about the future if we can hang in there, because again I can't underestimate the chaos it feels like to be working clinically in a system where all the structures around you have disappeared and now being reformed very rapidly. But I do believe that the good people of the NHS are keeping the NHS together, and I think we're going to emerge from this in a far stronger position than we're at, with conversations with really important people like Foundation Trust for the first time happening, and in my lifetime we're actually talking at serious conversations with chief executives of organisations to make things better.
So the political reality of the electoral cycle is meaning obvious practical complexity, and there seems to be consensus that the 12 to 18 months we're looking at the inertia. Possibilities beyond that are rising out of potential chaos, possibly a squirt of new money. The people in this room, essentially, their careers are to sell things to the NHS. They want to sell pharmaceutical products, they want to sell medtech products. They want to understand, how this evolution will happen. And if there is this consensus that we're moving towards a population-based entities, however they would be formed, whether they would be formed on the CCG footprint basis, whether they would be formed around the major providers, although obvious challenges there with regards to the legislation with regarding competition and monitors' duty to prevent anti-competitive behaviour. So if we take and run with the idea that we are going to be creating these accountable care bodies, which have defined population responsibility, it would seem to me that there's an opportunity and a threat at the same time for the pharmaceutical and medtech industries. The opportunity being to be able to sell once at greater scale, and the concomitant threat being that if you were to lose a contract with UCLH, Accountable Care Organisation, with Hurley Practice, ACO, you've potentially lost a very significant amount of revenue. I mean, just in terms of the practical realities for industry, how might those relationships start to happen as these organisations kind of coalesce and form? And is there a reality around that threat?
Can I say, first we need to make sure we're all understanding what we mean by an accountable care organisation, and what I take to be an accountable care organisation is where you hold the full capitated budget for your population, and then you fall or rise on that. If you overspend it, then you're doomed. And if you underspend it, then you have a sharing system. You can either have an ACO across an entire population, including your trusts, your community services, or you can have different models. So just to be... With respect to you selling stuff, I think it's always been the case, of course, that you've had... I don't think much is going to change. You lose a contract with UCLH, you've lost a major contract. I think where the difference is, in my mind, is that at the moment there is an enormous separation between what happens in the hospital and what they prescribe and I'd call the very expensive medicine and a lot of it, and what we do. And there is a very deep mismatch. And I think we're going to see in the future, as we've got one budget and one patient, actually it's not going to be possible. And I'm not saying this in a way to be derogatory, because I don't really understand how it works in your territory, but it's not going to be possible, for example, to go and do a deal with a hospital and to say, will you use this medicine, we've given you a reduction on it for use in your hospital, and then what happens if they come out in the community and we say, hang on a second, this medicine is 10 times the cost of what we're willing to prescribe in our formulary. I don't think it's going to be possible to do that anymore. I think it's going to be one budget, and whilst deals may be struck, they will have to be struck across the whole health community, not just one bit of the health community. I think it will make foundations, trusts step up, because not to be critical of hospitals, but we still have very few of them fully computerised. And last week I was trying to get all the doctors and nurses in our practice to decipher a prescription that came from the hospital. We still couldn't decipher it, nor could the pharmacist. So I think it's going to become much more efficient in hospitals as they become computerised and, in a sense, more like us in primary care.
I think it's about what was drummed into us, and communication strategy drummed into everyone else when we were creating Imperial. It's bench to bedside. It's how can we take the ideas and the innovation and actually make them useful and usable within the same health economy, within the same environment. Traditionally, we've been very, very good on the innovation, the creation, the discovery, and then it's gone elsewhere. And we haven't actually reinvested that knowledge and been able to reuse the new kit, the new skills where they've been founded. The academic health science centres were established to make that difference and to turn it into reality. And making a difference at the bedside, be that the bedside in your home or in a hospital, is crucial. It's where it counts. It takes it from being an idea, as we have at the moment, with we have the capability to do very, 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 very specialised cancer care, to do bespoke cancer care, a bespoke drug for a particular patient. We are well ahead in terms of our capability versus our infrastructure to deliver that. And I think creating infrastructure and the controlling mind, which sees the bench to bedside, which sees the level of creativity, is essential. And the difference you can make is identifying what are the opportunities that trusts are looking for, what is the difference that they're seeking to make, and how do you align yourselves to that? How can you help them to do that? How can you enhance their reputation? Equally, there are threats with that. I think back to the introduction of primary angioplasty in my and compare that to the introduction of the stroke reform units. Primary angioplasty, if we'd gone out to consultation on it, which we didn't, if we had spent 5 years gathering views and a consensus, which we didn't, we did it overnight, didn't tell anyone, and saved thousands of lives by getting ambulances to drive past the majority of A&Es, by closing cardiac wards, which were then redundant. If we can't understand the difference that we can make through innovation and get tied up in the system, in the politics, that's where it comes to a judgment call. So we need to recognise that the groundbreaking technology we can use can have fundamental impacts on the way that we organise our health services.
The importance of being sneaky.
At times.
Absolutely.
I guess that there's several different levels, isn't there, that you might want to forge appropriate relationships. So at the basic level, you have to sell products into NHS organisations, be they trust, be they primary care centres, and to do that you need to know which clinicians to speak to, of course. I mean, you know your business on that front far better than I would. But more at the, should we say, policy development level, I think that there are things that you could do, as it were, to be ahead of the game. I mean, just reflect back to my experience when I was an NHS chief executive. Often, I used to have board meetings, right, and very tedious. And, you know, sit there for how many hours it is in the day on the board meeting with all the agenda items, and there would always be a significant number of people from your industry sitting in the audience. And at the end of the long meeting, they'd come up to me and say, can we come and talk to you about X? To which the answer after all of that time sat in the board meeting would broadly be no, because, you know, I just want to get out of here and get away and do something different. And it struck me, even from that sort of rather silly example, that actually often you don't know what the best way to get into an organisation, to just have a discussion about where is this organisation going, what are your plans, what does the future look like, and therefore trying to find ways in to have those policy discussions was very difficult. The only route that seemed available was, you know, to attend a public meeting, which is just about the worst possible way of engaging with senior leaders in the NHS. And I mean, I think a better way than that, especially given if you think about the fragmentation that we talked about, you could be attending 74 such board meetings in the whole of London and still not getting anywhere with it. So what are the best ways in which you can see where the leaders are going to emerge for the future and try to connect to the networks that they have? So academic health science networks, absolutely in London, going to be a driver for change. So search those out and talk with them about how they're developing their thinking about driving change through networks rather than through the sort of traditional hierarchy. Clare talked about how CCGs will come together into networks, find out where they are and go and talk to the leaders of those about where they're taking them. The Mayor's Commission, Health Commission for London, there's a series of leaders for work streams which go across the whole of London. Talk to those people, they'll tell you about where they're taking their ideas. So connect to some of these networks that are emerging, and I think that that might in turn give you a step ahead of where everybody is, rather than what I used to observe, which is that you come in at the very, very tail end of. So if you're sitting at a public board meeting and some tedious paper is being rubber stamped, it is far, far, far too late for you to have had any influence on it. So I think it's, given the fragmentation that we've all described in one way or another, try to identify where these networks are emerging and get in with those. And that's not about selling a product, that's about trying to find how the direction of travel is changing and be ahead of that game before it actually turns into some, you know, boring paper being rubber stamped at a board meeting.
So, Rob?
Well, I guess the answer to the question depends on what you're selling. Are you selling products that have already been developed in competition with other suppliers, or are you selling products that will support an R&D agenda? But procurement in the NHS is, I think, very regrettably, number 99 on a list of 100 priorities. So